Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm going to preface this video by saying I might pronounce some of these words wrong. Please be respectful. This is just a passion project. For conciseness moving forward, I won't list the individual source at the end of every paragraph. If you'd like to follow along with the writing, my sources will be in the Substack and Patreon links in the description. Without further ado, Hanoi Hannah, the Vietnam War that public school never taught you about. If your school did teach you this, good for you. Just take a second to think about why different regions might receive varying levels of access to education and then come back to the video. Who was Hanoi Hannah? Trinh Thi Ngo, also known as Tu Wong, or most commonly Hanoi Hannah, born 1931, died September 2016, and was a radio personality. She was most known for her work during the Vietnam War, in which she made English broadcasts for North Vietnam directed at U.S. troops to demoralize them. Definition: cause someone to lose confidence or hope. Ngo was born in Hanoi to a successful businessman who owned the largest glass factory in French Indochina. At some point, she later stated that she was eager to learn English growing up as she wanted to watch some of her favorite films, like Gone with the Wind, 1939, without subtitles. Her family was able to provide her with private English lessons, and when she was 24, she joined the Voice of Vietnam radio station and was then chosen to read the English newscast. At that time, she had adopted the alias Tu Wong, which means autumn fragrance, and was shorter and easier for non-Vietnamese listeners to grasp. It was during the war that she became most popular. Her broadcasts on Radio Hanoi had gained recognition among U.S. soldiers. Ngo wrote scripts for the radio alongside the People's Army of Vietnam and translated them into English. These broadcasts were intended to scare and shame soldiers into leaving their posts. She would make 3 broadcasts each day, reading a list of newly killed or imprisoned Americans, sometimes playing popular U.S. anti-war songs to incite nostalgia and homesickness to persuade GIs that the U.S. involvement was unjust. Navy ships and personnel were also targets of the broadcast, where Ngo wrote out their names and stated that they would all die. She had also received and reproduced recordings of Americans against the war, later revealing that she believed these to be the most effective because Americans will believe their own people over an adversary. There are no verified historical records or other credible sources confirming several U.S. soldiers that deserted Vietnam due to Hanoi Hannah. Sometimes the soldiers were impressed when she mentioned the correct location of their unit, named U.S. casualties, and welcomed Navy ships into port with the correct arrival details and crew member names. Legends exaggerated her omnipresence, leading to the rumors of clues of PAVN attacks, and even as far as those who had girlfriends cheating on them back home. Most of her information came from U.S. military publications such as Stars and Stripes. There were claims that many soldiers stationed in Vietnam distrusted the U.S. Armed Forces radio bulletins and listened to Ngo's for information from the U.S. war correspondent Don North said. It wasn't that Hanoi Hannah always told the truth. She was most effective when she did tell the truth when the U.S. Armed Forces radio was fudging it. Ngo's broadcasts ran for 8 years, with the final one airing in 1973 as most American forces were leaving. During interviews later in life, she stated that she agreed with the purpose of the scripts and had never deviated from them. She believed that the United States should not have sent troops to Vietnam and that the country should have been allowed to resolve the situation itself. Ngo moved to Ho Chi Minh City with her husband after the war. She was offered a job at HTV, Ho Chi Minh City Radio television station, and continued to do some work for Voice of Vietnam. She had aspired to visit the United States and said she held no resentment for Americans. She died at the age of 85 on the 30th of September 2016. She is lived on by 2 children, including a son who was a painter in the United States. Other people who did similar things during other conflicts were Baghdad Bob, Axis Sally, Eastern Jewel, Lord Haha, Tokyo Rose, Soul City Sue, and Sister Mary. What happened during the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War was a conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam and allies in South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its most prolific, definition present in large numbers or quantities, ally, the United States. In Vietnam, the war was dubbed the American War in short, or the War Against Americans to Save the Nation in full. It was also part of a larger conflict, Indochina Wars, and an escalation of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. North Vietnam desired to unify the country under a single mode of government, communism, after defeating the French colonial administration in 1954. The South Vietnamese government wanted to be more closely aligned with the West. U.S. military advisors arrived in small numbers throughout the 1950s, large scale in 1961, and active combat units in 1965. In 1969, more than 500,000 military personnel from the United States had been stationed in Vietnam. At the same time, the Soviet Union and China poured resources into the north. More than 3 million people were killed in the Vietnam War, with more than half of these being Vietnamese citizens. Many in the States opposed this war, and it was only when it became too costly that the United States military forces were ordered to withdraw in 1973. Communist forces ended the war by seizing control of South Vietnam in 1975. The country was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year. Disclaimer: communism and socialism are two different things. See my writing, Harvey Milk 1 2 Skip a Few, Understanding Leftist Ideology, or Bro, What Are Politics on YouTube. They maintain many similarities, but socialists believe in gradual reform of the system while communists believe in revolutionary change. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century. Japanese forces invaded Vietnam during World War II. Ho Chi Minh was inspired by Chinese and Soviet communism and formed the Viet Minh League for the Independence of Vietnam to fight off both Japanese occupation and French colonial administration. In 1945, following defeat, Japan withdrew its forces from Vietnam. This left French-educated Emperor Bao Dai in control. Ho Chi Minh's forces immediately rose up, seeing opportunity here, and took over Hanoi, declaring a Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Wanting to regain control, Emperor Bao set up the state of Vietnam in July 1949 with Saigon as its capital. Armed conflict continued between northern and southern armies until the Viet Minh secured victory during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. The treaty signed at the Geneva Conference split Vietnam along the 17th parallel, 17 degrees north latitude, calling for nationwide elections for reunification to be held in 1956. In 1955, strongly anti-communist politician Ngo Dien Diem had pushed Bao aside to become president of the government of the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, at that time. Due to the Cold War, the United States was decidedly against any allies of the Soviet Union. Dwight D. Eisenhower pledged support to Diem and South Vietnam in 1955. Diem's security cracked down on Viet Minh sympathizers in the South with training and equipment from American military. Diem ridiculed these sympathizers, calling them Viet Cong, Vietnamese communists, and arrested around 100,000 people, with many of them brutally tortured and killed. By 1957, opponents of Diem's oppression began fighting back, and in December of 1960, those against Diem within South Vietnam formed the National Liberation Front to organize resistance. While it claimed to be autonomous and that most of its members were not communists, assumptions were made by those in Washington that the NLF was a puppet of Hanoi. JFK was working under the impression that if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, the others would follow when he increased aid to South Vietnam. He did, however, stop short of committing large-scale military intervention. Just 3 weeks before his assassination, some of Kennedy's generals succeeded in killing Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. This led to the political instability of South Vietnam, in which Lyndon B. Johnson was persuaded to increase military and economic support of the conflict. In retaliation to the torpedo boats attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, the U.S. began regular bombings in Vietnam. From 1964 to 1973, the United States also heavily bombed Laos during a CIA-led secret war that made it the most bombed country per capita in the world. Yes, it is pronounced Lao, as French colonial influence added the silent S in pluralization, which Americans applied their pronunciation rules to, making it no longer silent. Advisors were concerned about the continued escalations by Johnson and generally the entire war effort, as anti-war sentiment was building. Despite this, Johnson authorized the immediate mobilization of 100,000 troops at the end of July 1965 and an additional 100,000 troops in 1966. In smaller scales, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand sent troops to fight in South Vietnam. Even though body counts were mounting, the DRV and Viet Cong troops refused to give up. Troops were encouraged by the fact that they could reoccupy lost territory with the supplies coming from Cambodia and Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. North Vietnam also strengthened their air defenses through support from China and the Soviet Union. By 1967, American troops in Vietnam numbered near 500,000, with casualties at 15,058 killed and 109,527 wounded. Soldiers began to mistrust the reasons behind staying there, as well as the claims that the war was being won. Not to mention, later years saw the increase of physical and psychological deterioration in American soldiers. That included drug use, PTSD, mutinies, and more. Between July 1966 and December 1973, there were more than 503,000 desertion incidents. As Americans' televisions were flooded with horrifying images of the war, they turned against it as well. Demonstrators protested outside the Pentagon argued that civilians and not combatants were the main victims in supporting a corrupt dictatorship in Saigon. As approval ratings dropped, Johnson put a stop to the bombing in North Vietnam, though they continued in the South, and promised he'd dedicate the rest of his term to seeking peace over re-election. Nixon wanted to bring down the anti-war movement by appealing to what he believed was the silent majority. He withdrew U.S. troops, increased aerial and artillery bombardment, and gave the South Vietnamese training and weapons to control the ground. He called this Vietnamesization. North Vietnam continually insisted that the complete withdrawal of the U.S. was a condition to peace, and so conversations stalled. After the My Lai massacre, anti-war protests continued to build. The largest of these protests took place on the 15th of November 1969 in Washington, D.C., with over 250,000 peaceful demonstrators calling for the withdrawal of American troops. Americans were strongly divided on this, though, because some of the older generations believed that questioning the government was unpatriotic, but others believed that the war was symbolic to unchecked authority. Slowly, troops were withdrawn. This led those remaining to grow frustrated and morale dropped. Soldiers received dishonorable discharges in tens of thousands for desertion. Around 500,000 American men became draft dodgers between 1965 and 1973. Draft calls ended in 1972, and an all-volunteer army was instated the following year. Historically, to be eligible for federal aid, men were required to register with the Selective Service System that maintains the database for a potential draft. This was only changed in late 2020, though there is still a legal requirement for men 18 to 25 to enroll for the draft, I believe. In 1970, the US and South Vietnam invaded Cambodia. South Vietnam also led their own invasion of Laos, which North Vietnam pushed back against. As these invasions violated international law, a new wave of protests spread, one of which occurred at Kent State University in Ohio, in which the National Guard shot and killed 4 students. 10 days later, 2 students were killed by police during a protest at Jackson State University in Mississippi. Nixon authorized bombing raids in Hanoi and Haiphong, known as the Christmas bombings, which were condemned internationally. The United States and North Vietnam developed their final peace agreement in January of 1973. North and South Vietnamese conflict continued until the 30th of April 1975, when the DRV captured Saigon and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. The conflict had devastating results, with 2 million Vietnamese killed, 3 million wounded, and 12 million refugees. The infrastructure, economy, and more ruined. Reconstruction was an ongoing effort, and while buildings can be remade, there are parts that take much longer that I don't have the right words to describe. Vietnam's economy began to recover around 1986, and in the 1990s, trade and diplomatic relations with the United States resumed. The effects on the U.S. lasted a lot longer than the moment the troops returned home. Over $120 billion were spent on the conflict, which led to significant inflation. This was then exacerbated by an oil crisis in 1973. Psychologically, the effects were much worse. Returning veterans faced vitriol, definition, cruel, and bitter criticism from both the anti-war persons and the supporters of the war. One viewed the deaths of innocent civilians to be largely the fault of the troops, while the other saw that they lost the war. Not to mention the physical damage from exposure to Agent Orange. More harm was done to Vietnam with the spread of illnesses, birth defects, and continued deforestation, as millions of gallons of the chemical were dumped on the forest. Nevertheless, specific cancers popped up directly due to exposure. Memorials erected don't take away the harm caused nor the harm faced. I recognize that there are outliers here, right? I know and fully grasp that there are people who join the military with a specific intent to have power over someone. Power tends to draw in narcissists and other disordered behaviors like moths to a flame, but the blame here is not majorly on the soldiers. We can see that, right? Like, yes, each side of the conflict does questionable things to try to win that conflict, but the people giving those orders and deciding for the soldiers what is and isn't worth dying for are much more to blame. I'm not saying don't question the soldiers who just follow orders, because I see how that's wrong too, but to put most of the blame on the backs of the soldiers traumatized by what they trusted their government said was the right thing seems almost to ignore the point entirely. Also, considering that many of these men had not been able to dodge the draft, or maybe they put their beliefs in the wrong thing, are we to say that we've never made the wrong choice in trusting someone? I don't know. I'm getting sidetracked with this, obviously. I'm not attempting to be apologetic. I see that the United States did much wrong with this conflict. I just think we let a lot of young men down when we put that weight on them instead of the government that forced them away from their families. Why might we not have learned these things? The obvious reason here is due to the level of controversy. American schools briefly cover most conflicts because they want you to grow up with a sense of patriotism. Now, I understand you can't teach a 5-year-old about the gruesome deaths of the indigenous peoples of America and that things have to be phrased differently, but I've spoken with younger siblings about complex topics and helped them grasp understanding that the United States history can be a scary one to truly understand. I don't think it's impossible to teach the truth to students. I think most school boards just don't want to. When I got to high school was when we learned more of what Christopher Columbus actually did. The concepts didn't go as in depth as I would have liked, but did not know how to ask for. Christopher Columbus Day was also still a thing when I was in high school. I feel like it still is. When you look online, it'll say that public school systems do teach about the Vietnam War. However, the depth and scope vary widely depending on state, district, grade level, and each individual teacher's approach. Basically, there are guidelines, but if a teacher isn't particularly interested in answering questions or digging deeper into a lesson, the students don't come to understand US history very strongly. We can't even begin to think about the rest of the world's history either. When we talk about the war solely in terms of winners and losers, there are a lot of perspectives that get lost. EJ, Ian Ellie. The perspectives of some of the South Vietnamese people are provided in E.J. Iannelli's article on Humanities Washington named What We Still Don't Understand About the Vietnam War. This article speaks more to the portrayal of the war in American media and how it differs from many of the perspectives in southern Vietnam and even many American veterans. Something I find important that is noted is that the people interviewed don't attempt to defend themselves. They admit that there was corruption during the war and the times that they themselves had mixed feelings. This article is more aligned with mine in that it is attempting to have unheard perspectives be reached. It isn't about saying one side was all good or all bad, because there was so much gray area. It's about understanding better by trying to hear from each side of the conflict. I think much of the time we get too caught up on right and wrong that we forget that most of the world doesn't live in black and white. When you let a single emotion cloud over you, it disrupts any chance to see nuance. You lose out on understanding other people better when you think your guilt is the most important thing. And maybe that's the other part of it. Teaching nuances is hard. Key thing here, I said hard, not impossible. Perhaps we don't prepare teachers enough for the level of variation they will have to make lessons to get their students to develop critical thinking necessary to show interest. A common sentiment I have heard from teachers is the sense of dejectedness, definition dispirited, that comes from trying to get students involved. These kids are developing their identity and sense of self among peers that may come from very different backgrounds, which leaves a lot of room for conflict to arise when they aren't taught to seek out each other's perspectives. If we first sought to understand, I think not only would kids get so much more out of school, but out of life as well. Too many young boys and girls are taking their lives because they feel unseen and unheard. I think a lot of that could change with minor shifts in ourselves. Anyways, finishing up, I know this was longer than my last few videos, so I don't expect you to have everything perfectly sorted out from just one essay, but if you take anything from this, let it be one exercise of compassion. Try to understand someone a little bit better, even if it's just yourself. Thank you for being here. If you're a fan of investigative journalism and philosophy, subscribe for free today. If you'd like to further support my efforts, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked below. Only occasional posts are for purchase. Everything else is free and comes 2 days earlier on average, which also helps me cover research materials, i.e., purchasing text, as well as my time and effort in development. Along with that, it supports my real life effort in making education free and widespread. I thank you for your support no matter what form. Other than that, I just hope you have an amazing rest of your day, rest of your weekend, and thank you for being here.